the Australian Education Bill 2013 and the Australian Education Consequential and Transitional Provisions Bill 2013. But before I do that, Madam Acting Deputy President, can I just firstly acknowledge, with you being in the chair as Acting Deputy President this morning and close to this afternoon, but this morning, can I acknowledge the enormous contribution that you have made to the Senate? This is your third last day.
Thank you.
In the Commonwealth Parliament. We all have, those of us that have worked with you on committees and certainly have been working with you in this chamber, have high regard for your professionalism, the depth of your appreciation of so many issues, the breadth of your knowledge in relation to the processes of this place, but particularly, may I say, your respect and empathy with so many communities, particularly the Indigenous community. And I know that you have taken the opportunity, probably rightfully so, taken the opportunity at times to educate me on your perspectives on that. Congratulations for your time, your contributions, and all the best following the end of this 43rd Parliament. If I could turn to these bills, and as I said, it is with pleasure that I rise to speak on these, because education is an issue that I have had a lifelong passion for, and in fact it was an issue that I raised in my first speech in this place and spoke on at length about my particular personal passion in relation to the education and what we provide for all those young people coming through the school system and on to tertiary education. But not only do I speak in terms of the Coalition's perspective, my personal perspective on this, but I'd also like to rise and be a voice for the... I was trying to think, Madam Acting Deputy President, whether I should term it as hundreds or thousands, but like so many, I have been contacted by probably now thousands who are either principals or school teachers, certainly parents, who have all expressed their enormous concern about these education bills and have written to us, called, actually visited me in my electorate office. We have spent an enormous time actually listening to the concerns of those who are caught up in the education process, whether that is as a stakeholder, that is as a family, parents who have children going through the system, or as those that seek to pursue a career in the education sector. There are so many that have expressed their concerns, and it is as much for them that I speak today as their voice in expressing their concerns on these bills. In my first speech in this place, I reflected on my parents' interests and passion in education, and how that through them they taught me that education is the #1 equaliser in society. It is actually access to education and choice of education that actually provides an opportunity to give people a hand up in life, not a hand out. And that is why it is something of such critical concern to us in the Coalition, and it is why we have been so consistent over the years, and I refer to the former Howard government period. It is why we spent so much time and had such a priority in this area to ensure that strong education standards applied to all within Australia. I have to say that on a personal basis, I think that one of the great things that we should be considering is actually having a system whereby a fiscal amount, if you like, was applied and assigned to an individual child, regardless of where those children were educated, so that the parents themselves had the opportunity to choose what school was in the best interest of their children, but more importantly, what schools reflected the values and principles in the way in which those families wish to raise their children. But that is an argument for another day. If I could just briefly reflect on my parents, though, because I think it is a great example. My brother and sister and I were the first in our family that were offered private education. We were the first in our extended family that went to private schools. Interestingly, though, the three of us did not go to the same school. My parents determined that each of us had different requirements, different needs, and they determined different schools would bring out the best in us and actually suit us in very different ways. And I think that is a very close example, certainly for me, where different schools and different principles that are applied at those schools actually support individuals in different ways, and it's the parents, only the parents, who can determine what education system best suits their own children. And so whatever education public policy is introduced or mandated by a government should be very cognisant of that fact. It is a crying shame that on the third last day of the 43rd Parliament here, that these bills are number 23rd and 24 out of 55 bills that are being guillotined. It is an absolute crying shame, as Senator Mason alluded to when he sought to suspend standing orders so that we could debate this longer. It is an absolute travesty for us all that in the House they only had 2 hours to actually look at, scrutinise and deal with these bills that the government themselves, and we just heard from Senator Pratt, bills that the government themselves believe are absolutely critical to the long-term future of all Australians. So if it is so important, why is it that the government is only allowing two hours in the House and less here in the Senate for us to debate a public policy which they are proposing, which they, the government, have suggested is so important to them, without wanting to influence those who might be listening to this broadcast, without wanting to influence those that make their own minds up on this. I think the facts stand for themselves. So it's an absolute tragedy that the inquiry into this only went for 3 days. Something as significant and as comprehensive as this should be only sought to sit for 3 days to look into the implications of the introduction of the Australian Education Bill and the Australian Education Consequential and Transitional Provisions Bill 2013. And I would hesitate to suggest that this, unfortunately, and I do say unfortunately, because I think that this is just too serious to play politics with. Unfortunately, this is yet another example of a rushed public policy, rushed politics that is serving another agenda other than the one that we should be critically concerned about, and that is the future of our youth here in Australia. I would also suggest, Madam Acting Deputy President, that the government is being quite misleading when they keep on referring to this as the Gonski, loosely, I do say loosely, as referring to this as the Gonski recommendations. Because the one person The one person we haven't heard from since these bills have been formulated for us to consider is actually the esteemed David Gonski himself. He is not associating himself with these particular bills. What he did was undertake a very comprehensive review that he has made a number of recommendations, and the government has cherry-picked aspects of that review and have incorporated it in this. So I would suggest that it is very deceptive to suggest that this is the conclusion and all the recommendations that were made in the review, because it is far from the truth. And we know that because the Gonski review called for no less than $6.5 billion in new funding each and every year. That's $6 billion, $6.5 billion in each and every year, which amounts to over $39 billion. So let's just put that into some sort of context, because what are we looking at here? What we're actually hearing is that Labor has promised $9 billion by 2009, which is 6 years away. So there is a dramatic difference between what Mr. David Gonski, was recommending in terms of the injection of funds into so that the education sector could be restructured. There is a very big difference in what he was proposing and what we are seeing before us. But as Senator Mason has commented on just earlier on, the issue here, and it is one that applies to absolutely every issue that this government touches, that is that they think that if you actually throw a bucket load of cash at something and have a huge injection of cash, that is going to come up with the best outcome in whatever area it is. That is such a typically Labor and Greens view that the solution for absolutely everything that is put before us is always throwing money at it. And I would proffer that that is not the case, Madam Acting Deputy President, because we have examples on the table, whether it was under the former Rudd government or the current Gillard government, there are examples after examples where throwing good money after bad did not return good public policy. It did not come up with the outcome. And we only have to go back and look at the school halls, the school halls that were built across the country in a flurry. Some $14.5 billion. $14.5 billion was thrown at building new school halls, and in fact I visited a number of schools during construction process, and there was one small school that had less than 200 students in northern Victoria, a small country town that had $1 million directed to building a new edifice to this Gillard government, and they themselves said that they had never seen such money, such a cash flow into their small country town in the history of the town. And this was $1 million. If you actually translate that across under 200 students, it doesn't take much to work out whether or not that was an effective way to increase the education outcome for each of those children. And I have to say that the parents I met at that school on that day were highly questioning of the appropriate way in which that was being delivered. They actually said, well, if the government wants to throw $1 million at us, we're hardly going to say no to it. But the point was that there was no real belief that that was going to change the education outcomes. That is just one example. We look at the computer in schools program. Every student would have a computer on their desk. when when Prime Minister Gillard was the former Education Minister. We remember that. It changed over time. How did that improve the standards of the kids? Not one over there on the other side of the chamber could attest to the fact that that program in any way demonstrably increased the education outcome for those students. And I am yet to hear anyone suggest that the $14.5 billion, and I say it again because we're talking here about $9 billion by 2019, but we have already seen $14.5 billion spent in building edifices, buildings, structures, with no suggestion that that in any way has improved the education outcome of one student, not one student. So I would suggest that the government really are, if they were serious about increasing the education outcomes for all Australian students, they would have had a far more comprehensive and appropriate look at the way in which they do that. Because history suggests that this is not going to be the case. The federal budget, in fact, shows that a $315 million reduction in school funding over the forward estimates for the next 4 years is actually what we're looking at here. And if I look at and take, which was printed off recently, print off the Victorian schools,
Senators will be reminded, sorry, Senator Kroger, not to debate across the chamber.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President.
Senator Kroger.
I have some 4 pages of Victorian schools and the way that they will be affected by this funding decision. And not one of those, I will take your interjections. There are 4 pages of Victorian schools here that are going to be dramatically affected by this funding arrangement. And I have to say, Senator Collins,
Minister Collins. Senator Kroger.
Madam Acting Deputy President, I would be delighted to take the interjection that I've just heard across the chamber, because I would like to ask, why is it that small Catholic schools with very low funding thresholds are able to deliver higher education standards than so many other schools that have a higher and stronger funding model? There are many Catholic schools that operate on and independent schools that operate on very, very small and tight budgets that successfully come up with good education outcomes. And in my mind, there is one real reason for that, and that is about teacher quality. Because what we heard during, and Madam Acting Deputy President, you participated in this inquiry, what we heard during the inquiry into teaching and learning, maximising our investment in Australian schools inquiry, which was concluded only recently, what we heard during that inquiry was the critical role of the teachers in terms of the education outcomes of the kids. It is by raising the standard of the teachers and actually rewarding them and rewarding those very good, effective and committed teachers that have the greatest impact on the students. During that inquiry, Madam Acting Deputy President, you will recall a young man who I think was from a school in Cranbourne in Victoria, who was a refugee here and was so concerned about marginalisation within that school that he took it upon himself, with the support of teachers, to run programs himself within that school. It was the teachers, this was out of left field, it was the teachers themselves that identified the strength of what he was doing, that supported him, that makes the difference to that school today. Madam Acting Deputy President, I hate to say it, but this isn't the paper it's worth on. The government's a disgrace. It's another public policy, and it should be tossed out of these doors.
The time has expired. Senator Madigan.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. Rise to speak about Australian education.